Welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Charles Good. Today's conversation dives deep into the science of learning, and guiding us is one of the field's most dynamic voices, Dr. Cynthia Nebel. Dr. Nebel is the Director of Learning Services and Associate Professor of Psychiatry at St. Louis University's School of Medicine. She's also held influential academic and leadership roles at Vanderbilt, Lindenwood, and Washburn universities. She's a core member of the Learning Scientists, the team making evidence-based learning strategies accessible worldwide through blogs, podcasts, and videos. And her best-selling books include Ace That Test and Uniting Learning Science and Talent Management. What sets her apart is her ability to bridge research and real life, helping students, professionals, and leaders learn smarter, remember longer, and thrive in today's demanding world. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Through candid conversations and expert perspectives, we dive into the challenges, breakthroughs, and practical lessons that shape exceptional leadership. Welcome to the program, Cindy.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much.
So I always like to start each episode, Cindy, with just our listeners learning more about you and your background. What initially drew you into the field of learning science?
I mean, admittedly, I went into graduate school thinking I wanted to study neuroscience. And so I joined the Washington University in St. Louis program that is brain behavior and cognition. And I worked there with Dr. Henry Roediger, who I believe you've chatted with before, and Dr. Mark McDaniel was my PhD advisor. And I pretty quickly got a little disillusioned with the neuroscience work and really excited about the work that they were doing trying to translate information into classrooms. So it was a heavy memory-based program. So we learned a lot of the basic mechanisms of human memory. And there was sort of a zeitgeist at the time where they were in the middle of writing Make It Stick. A bunch of us who sort of have connections to that program got together and started talking about how we do such a good job of taking what we know and writing it up and publishing it in journal articles that no one ever reads. And so we said, gosh, how can we make a difference with this work? Because we know so much and it's not out there in the world, but it could really make a difference and be impactful for folks. So that's kind of how the learning scientists got started and just grew organically because there was a real thirst for this information out in the world. So I find it all very fascinating and really exciting to get to see the impact of that work.
How has your perspective evolved since you began applying these principles in real world organizations?
It's evolved, no doubt about it. The original work back in grad school days was all about applying to classrooms. And it wasn't until I started at Vanderbilt that I was teaching in an education doctorate program there. And my students were no longer traditional undergraduate students whose primary job was to learn. Now they were military generals and VPs of organizations and superintendents and people who were not, their everyday life was not teaching to students. That's not what they were doing day in and day out. And so I had to kind of expand my understanding of what I was doing. The basic mechanisms were the same, but I'm no longer talking just about formal learning. I had to start talking about informal learning. So learning as communication, because fundamentally, if I'm telling you this today and hoping that you'll remember it tomorrow, that's learning, right? So talking to employees and hoping they'll remember it and apply it is informal learning. And then even thinking about self-directed learning, that's what I do now with my medical students and looks wildly different than what you're doing in a classroom setting. I'm not giving them assignments to do. They're trying to figure it out on their own. So the formal versus informal versus that self-directed learning, it turns out that our brains are the same across all three of those settings. So the mechanisms are the same, but how you apply them and how you do the good work of learning has to change. I had to expand not my understanding of learning and memory, but my ability to apply it to everything. My understanding of learning and memory turned into something much more ubiquitous than it was prior to that. That's for sure.
I love that. And you're right, with the adults, with kids, with the classroom setting versus real world settings and self directed learning. Underlying principles could stay the same, but there's a lot of nuance and differences in how they need to learn and how they're able to learn more effectively. For those new to the topic, how would you define learning science?
It's a really important question, actually, because when we look out to the world, people define it in a lot of different ways. So there's a difference between the science of learning and learning science. For our purposes, I don't think it matters. I'll just give you my definition, which is really the rigorous exploration of learning. So when I'm talking about learning science, the emphasis is on science. I want evidence-based strategies that we're using for folks, and I want good evidence. So anything that I'm talking about as learning science is something that we have often hundreds of years of research to support its use across different modalities, across different materials, different types of learners, that we know that these things are things that work. And it's because we have experimental evidence for that. And there are lots of other things that probably are good for learning, for sure. But I don't want to talk about anything that's a fad that we don't have a lot of evidence for yet. And I don't want to be talking about something that only works in some situations and not in others. Instead, I want to be talking about the science, the stuff that we know works because we've done these experiments where we have causal evidence to say this strategy causes learning and not other things, not just anecdotes, not just experiences.
That's good to know because many people look at the fads, look at the quick fixes, the hacks, and those really aren't the evidence based strategies. And in a world where skills must be constantly updated, learning how to learn, in my opinion, is the meta skill of this century. It really is the underlying skill that accelerates everything else. And it's disconcerting to see how it's not talked about enough. Even though we spend billions of dollars on learning and development within corporations, companies, it's really foundational to all of that. And I believe many people haven't updated their learning operating system since they were in school. And that operating system wasn't that effective in school to begin with. So
Yeah, that's
it's
right.
time for an upgrade.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right because so many of the things that are good for learning are counterintuitive, right? So if you're just doing the stuff that feels like learning, you're probably not doing the right things, right? Because we have what we call sometimes desirable difficulties. Like learning is hard work. And so if it feels easy, it's probably not working. And that's what most of us did in school was the stuff that felt good because it feels like it's working, but it's not really. It's actually really interesting because when I am trying to talk about these strategies, the easiest sell is usually when I'm talking to like kindergarten teachers. Because they're like, of course you're going to try to retrieve information. How else can you learn? You've got to quiz them constantly, ask them questions. And then somewhere along the line in formal learning, we like forget how to learn. And so we got to come back to that at some point. Yeah, it has the potential to be so impactful, but it really is something that folks have to learn how to do. You have to learn how to learn because it's not intuitive.
A lot of those strategies are counterintuitive. And also believe the mindset gets in the way with a lot of people as well, that they think they've learned it. And really, from talking to Robert Bjork to talking to Daniel Willingham and some of the preeminent cognitive psychologists, they state that it's that familiarity, right? If you read the book and you're passively learning something, you're not really retaining it. You're not really engaging with it in such a manner that you're going to be able to recall it later. So we also have to address their overconfidence with what they think they're learning. Are you really learning it to the degree that you need? Because back in school, you could cram for the test the next day, and that worked. But when you're in the corporate world, you don't have a test usually the next day. You want to be able to retain and incorporate and apply these principles, which makes that type of learning ineffective.
I think you just hit upon like the major issues, which is we're trying to retain it over the long term and we're trying to apply it. And the strategies that you use for those things are actually slightly different. But very important, right?
Well, how can organizations bridge the gap between lab-based findings in learning science and the messy realities of everyday workplace learning, given that so much professional knowledge is acquired informally?
I firmly believe that what you need to know is the mechanism. You need to understand why any given strategy works, not just what the hack is, but why that hack works so that you can take it and apply it somewhere else. Because it is absolutely true that much of this work has been conducted in laboratories. That's where the vast majority of this stuff is investigated. But also, as I mentioned, I don't talk about the things that haven't been investigated outside of that domain. And brains are brains, right? Whether we're in a laboratory, in a classroom, or in a workplace environment, the brain is working the same way. So the underlying mechanisms are similar. How we apply them does differ, though. One of the key components here of figuring out how to apply it is knowing why it's working so you can apply it effectively, but also seeing lots of concrete examples of how it can be applied. I think that's a real critical piece that's often missing in a lot of the work that's out there is that we understand things theoretically, but then to take that and apply it in the life that you're living and the situations that you see, it really needs the added concrete examples of how you can do that. And so it's a big focus of my work is to make sure that we're giving lots of those examples of how things can be translated. But you should trust that these strategies are things that are based on hundreds of years of work with lots of different settings. Even though a lot of it is lab based, it does translate to everyday life for sure.
But with the big picture view in mind, let's dive into those key learning science principles that all professionals can apply. So, what are some of the most effective strategies for professional learners to actively engage with so they can move beyond passive reading and listening? Because highlighting, rereading the text wasn't effective back then, it's not effective now. Give us some other strategies that we can use that you've researched and written about.
Yeah, so I would probably lean on three strategies here that I think are the easiest. They translate to pretty much anything that you're working with and are going to be impactful for everyone. The first is honestly note taking. So when we look at notes, like you often think of note taking just as like a formal student strategy for formal learning. But in reality, good note taking does lead to long term retention. But I'm going to put the emphasis on good note taking. So we don't want to be doing like verbatim note taking where you're just like copying down like quotes from a book that you're reading or something. That's not terribly effective. But ideas are. So the act of writing, and when I say writing, I don't mean handwriting. It can be typing, it can be on a tablet, it can be wherever. But the act of translating knowledge and putting it in your own words and writing down ideas and questions about it is very effective for helping that information stick. So while you're reading something, yeah, take some notes in the margin or whatever. Even if you never look at those again, the act of doing that is helpful. But then that gets us into the other two strategies, which is you probably should look at it again, right? That's like the easiest strategy that I can say is one and done is in fact one and done. The closest thing that we have to a law in cognitive psychology is the forgetting curve. And that is when we learn something, we forget it really rapidly. So if you're reading a book or sitting in onboarding, whatever the case might be, the chances that you're going to forget that are very high unless you revisit it. So, what we know helps with slowing down the rate of forgetting is spaced repetition. So, seeing things again spaced out over time. And then I prefer to just talk about spaced retrieval because that's enhanced even more if you're trying to recall that information and not just reread it. So, in an ideal world, if you're reading a book that you find to be impactful and you're hoping that you can hold on to that over time and use that in your practice, you don't want to just read the book. You want to have some way of retrieving that information later on, of revisiting that information spaced out over time.
Great strategies. And just to recap, the summarization really needs to be the main ideas in your own words, paraphrasing. Don't just write them out verbatim. Retrieval, close the book and try to recall what you just read. And then the spacing, and Mark McDaniel stated the number one question asked is how long? And it just depends on the individual, depends on the material. But Mark had a good metric or gauge to say not too long where you forget everything, but long enough to where you forget something, right? So that you have to be active in your retrieval and make it more effortful.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And it is. It is the number one question that I get asked too is how much forgetting should we have? And it's such a circular answer, isn't it? Because it's, oh, you should forget a little bit. But the only way to know if you've forgotten a little bit is to do it, to try to retrieve something. But that is the answer. You don't want to be just spacing out after a few minutes. You You want to revisit it after you've forgotten a little bit of it. And you're the only person who's going to know that. And it depends on how well you learned it the first time and what you knew before you started.
Well, and we face a lot of constraints in the corporate world because even though these are smarter strategies, such as cramming to distributed practice, so you're not cramming the night before, you're spreading out that practice, professionals are always pressed for time and deadlines. So they say, yeah, that's great if we could do it that way. That's just not ideal, Charles. Is there any starter strategies you can help professionals with from shifting from that cramming to more of a distributed practice with what they want to learn?
Yeah. So honestly, if we're just talking about distributed practice, I'm going to put retrieval off to the side for a second, even though it's my favorite strategy. I'm going to set it down for a second. And I would imagine kind of combining the first two things I was talking about. Let's say it's from a book that they're reading a book and they want to make sure that they retain that. If they're doing good notes, off to the side, they're writing down their highlights, their high points. What were the things that I want to remember from this book later on? In my own words, paraphrased or ideas that they had. It's pretty simple to just say, I'm going to start Monday morning by opening up my list of ideas, my big core value takeaways. So that's how I'm going to start my day. Whatever it might be, that it's not a huge thing to do that and just to take a quick list. And maybe you refine your list over time. Maybe it's your top 10 things that came from wherever. But to kind of strategically just have a time point where you're just taking a look at stuff. It's such a simple thing, but it's really powerful for remembering that stuff long term.
I've even found to begin even with micro spacing, even short space study sessions are better than a single marathon sprint. You can calendar short review blocks across days or weeks, build in designated review times after meetings or learning events, but just use reminders, use technology to nudge you into that spaced recall so that it's just not a one and done like you mentioned, which is quickly forgotten.
Yeah, so that was the next thing that I was going to talk about is using some technology to do some of this stuff too. So particularly when you want to amplify that. Yeah, distributed practice is good. And I used to talk to my students about starting meetings with some kind of review of things that we've talked about before. But that can be enhanced so much more if it's a retrieval event and not just a review event. So starting a meeting by saying, hey, folks, you remember last month when we were talking about this? I just want you to take a second, write down all the ideas you have about that topic. You've now changed this from you telling them what you want them to remember to them trying to generate it first. Then maybe you can have a quick discussion about it. That's the same thing as doing a quiz, by the way, but don't tell them that. They won't like it. Similarly, you can use technology for this. So I actually just went in and was like asking ChatGPT to tell me, hey, if I wanted to do some spaced retrieval of some topics that I got out of a book, how could I do that? What would be a really simple way? And it gave me detailed instructions for how to do a calendar merge where I would give an Excel file to my calendar and it would send me an email every Monday morning asking me a question about something that I want to know about. And so it's a one and done situation, super easy to do and then it does it for me. And I just get that reflection moment on whatever day of the month you want to have it. But it's all scheduled out for you in advance and you don't have to think about that. And we have research that looks very similar to that. There's a great medical school research study where they did something similar but with emails. They would just email a student once a week on a given topic and the retention for that was more than double what it was without the email. It's a very simple kind of strategy, but just seeing that periodically is extremely effective.
And with technology, with AI, it can be used to think for you, or it can be used to help you with all these learning practices where you can put in the documents and you can have a teach back with it. I've done that before. It
Yeah.
helps you recall certain things. So there's a lot of opportunities to use AI and technology to help in getting that learning to stick. But if not used correctly, of course, it can think for you. And that's not really the intention of what we would like to see it used for, in getting you to differentiate your brand and have that human piece that's really distinctive versus just technology giving you the answers for everything that you need to have recalled.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I spend a lot of time talking about AI these days and exactly that topic that if certainly AI can make our lives easier, right? And you can just like offload tasks to AI. And I don't see any harm in doing that necessarily. But yeah, if your goal is to be able to apply to novel situations, then you need to be doing that. If you're asking AI to do it for you, AI is the one getting better at transfer, not you. And that's the fundamental key part with AI, I think, is that it can really enhance learning if we let it, but we have to still be the ones doing the mental effort.
Absolutely. And I've seen it too, where it's helped me with thick academic papers, right? You can put it in there and it's going to put it into layman's terms, make it more applicable. So it really opens up the possibilities in your world to look at this academic research and be able to apply it in real world situations and helping you in doing that. But like you said, there's also that for the AI just to do it for you, which is not what we want. How about the learning myths? There's so many learning myths that we encounter every day that people are stuck on. There's the one with learning styles. There's the 10,000 hour rule. There's we only use 10% of our brains. Maybe name a couple of the most common ones that you think need to be debunked so people can really get to these more proven learning strategies and not be caught up in what they think works.
You just took at least one of the ones that I would have mentioned here, which is learning styles. But I actually would lump learning styles in with like a left brain, right brain mentality too. Really anything where we're trying to categorize people in that way is probably inappropriate. And we don't have the research to support it. All of these things have like a nugget of truth, right? Yes, people have different preferences and motivation certainly impacts learning. And people have they do, in fact, have lateralization in our brain where the left side of our brain is used more for language processing and the right for more spatial processing, for example. But we're all using all of it. Oh, I'm getting into the 10% too. I'm just going to talk about all of them here. No, but I think that the ones where we're boxing people in and labeling them are particularly dangerous and counterproductive for most of our organizational leaders. Because what you really want is to cultivate skills in people. So if I'm going to box them in and I'm going to say, hey, on this team, I need a left brained person. So we're going to bring this person in. What you've done is made it so that the more right brain person can't develop that skill. And it's all of these things are saying that there's something that someone can't do. And that's what I hate because that's not what it means. So when we're looking at learning styles, it is not that someone can't learn auditorily or visually. It's that they might have a preference for that. And so boxing people in like that really limits them. It limits what we can do with the talent that we have. And so I think that can be really, really problematic. But also getting into what can stop people from using the strategies that we were talking about. So you just mentioned that. So I want to talk just for a second more about, you mentioned it before, but this idea that when we are doing, let's say, less effective strategies, the cramming, the rereading, the highlighting, all of those things lead to overconfidence, like you said. Because as you read something more than once, as you do something more than once in a row, it becomes more fluent, it becomes faster. In that moment, you do, in fact, know it better than if you were to space it out. In that moment, you do. Right. So it leads to this feeling of fluency and this feeling of overconfidence because, as you said, the test, and in the real world, it's not a test, but the time that you want to use this information is not right now. If it is, by all means, reread 1,000 times. You'll know it really well in that moment, but it won't stick with you long term. So it's not exactly what we call a learning myth, but it is kind of related to this what gets in the way of our ability to do this. That is that counterintuitive piece of things.
Well, and the other big myth that I hear a lot is effective learning should feel easy. No, Robert Bjork said desirable difficulties. It's going to feel effortful and tough. And you're not going to feel like you get it right away, but trust the process because you are learning it in a deeper way.
There's another really interesting study that looked at interleaving, and we haven't talked about interleaving at all. And I think it's maybe a little less applicable for our organizational leaders, but it's one of the desirable difficulties is mixing up the order in which you review information instead of always doing it in the same order. And when we look at performance when people are practicing, it's like 80%. They never get to 100% because it's difficult compared to just doing the same thing over and over again where they're at 100% during practice. In this particular study, they came back the next day. The delay is one day. And the folks who were at 80% are now at like 78%. The folks who were at 100% are at 38%. So I mean, it's so impactful to see that and go, okay, so maybe when things are hard, that's not a bad thing.
Absolutely. And Mark McDaniel talked quite a bit about that with me with interleaving. And he said that really helps with the transfer. And we can get into more of that later. Also wanted to mention too, because I hear this a lot, that brain training apps, they're expanding their working memory by the end dual back tests or luminosity. And this is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And yet it only demonstrates very near transfer for certain tasks. So in the end, right, translating it to layman's terms, it doesn't work. Correct?
Yeah, yeah. It works for the tasks that are in the app. So if you want to get better at Sudoku, do Sudoku. If you want to get better at crosswords, do crosswords. If you want to get better at luminosity, do luminosity. But the extent to which that translates into everyday life is pretty limited. And it really is practice. So whatever it is that you want to get better at, do that. And that gets back to our AI conversation too. If you want to get better at it, do it. Don't have AI do it for you. And the thing that really gets me about these is that there's a lot of sort of like preying on individuals who might have issues already. And then those are the people we're going to take the money from, even though we know it's not going to actually help them. It hurts.
The other common myth that I hear too is that we have now the attention span of a goldfish. And Dr. Daniel Willingham out of the University of Virginia says that's not the case. That hasn't been proven. He can show that we can focus for long periods of time on certain things, that really technology is just incentivizing us not to focus for very long periods because there's other things that are distracting us in the environment. What are your thoughts on technology and its ability to reduce our focus and our attention span?
I mean, again, I think it's kind of a practice makes perfect kind of situation. It's not that our attention spans are low. If you can sit and watch a Netflix documentary and stay focused on it the whole time, that's proof you have a good attention span. That's not the problem. The problem is that we have less practice focusing on things that we find boring. Right. And so there are other things that come from technology too. So, one example of this is the reliance on GPS for spatial navigation, right? As we do less spatial navigation on our own and we rely on GPS, we're not as good at doing that, but that's because we haven't practiced doing it. So I think the way that technology is really changing our attention is that we spend a lot more time with split attention where I am half in this meeting and half on my phone and I'm going back and forth between the two. And that means that our ability to retain either of them, our ability to perform either of those tasks is far decreased. But it's not that we couldn't do it effectively if we just put the darn phone away and focused on what we needed to focus on. So I think technology changes the way that we approach tasks. It changes what we're practicing over time, but it hasn't changed our ability. Does that make sense?
It does. That makes perfect sense. Well, looking forward, what trends or developments in learning science do you think will shape the workplace of the future?
So I don't think that learning science is going to change all that much. I think that we have a really good understanding of how folks learn. I think one area that's ripe for research is the interaction between learning science and the science of motivation, for example, right? That doesn't get a lot of love in the basic research because, as you mentioned earlier, that makes things messy. And we like to be able to control things and make causal arguments, but it is really fundamentally important when we look at the real world, when we look at classrooms and when we look at organizations. So I do see more applied research happening currently, and I imagine more will happen here in the next 10 to 15 years as more people get interested in it. That's part of the driving force here is that there was a big shift to do applied research in classrooms for formal learning. And as more individuals like you start spreading the good word that learning science can make a difference in other domains too, I do imagine that we'll have some more applied research in those areas. And then I think that we're going to see a lot of research looking at AI and learning. And so I think that research is going to be really critical in looking at how we can leverage AI to enhance learning and how we can convince people to do that. I think that's the other big area is implementation science is coming in here a bit because it's so easy for us to talk about research. And I see this with my med students on a daily basis too, is I'm like telling them, like, if you want to pass the test, you've got to retrieve this information. And it's not until they really start struggling that they start listening to me. So I think that's a key part here too, is how do we get people to do this when it is so counterintuitive and it doesn't feel good? How do we convince people that there is a right way to do it without them feeling the failure first?
Therein lies the and I like what you said earlier too. What GPS did for our spatial awareness, Google unfortunately did for our memory, feeling that we don't need to remember anything. And the fear is with AI, it's going to take away our thinking abilities because we're just going to outsource our thinking to technology. So we have to use it and leverage it in the right ways. There's a lot of opportunities, but a lot of potential pitfalls that we have to avoid as well as we navigate this process. I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.